An empire can die from invasion, but it can also be transformed by victory. In AD 312, outside Rome, a Roman emperor defeated another Roman emperor at the Milvian Bridge. Yet this was not merely a civil war. It was a contest over who could command obedience in a world where old institutions still stood, but old certainty had already begun to fracture. By the late 3rd century AD, the Roman Empire had become too immense for simplicity. Its frontiers stretched across continents. Its armies were indispensable to survival, but those same armies had become kingmakers. Its emperors projected majesty, but the machinery beneath that majesty was alarmingly unstable. The empire required constant military readiness, constant fiscal extraction, and constant demonstrations that the ruler at the center possessed not merely office, but destiny. That was the central weakness of the late Roman order. It depended on legitimacy that was always in danger of becoming personal, improvised, and contested. A stable succession should have been institutional. Instead, it was often a wager placed on bloodline, army loyalty, elite consent, and plain survival. Diocletian understood the danger. His answer was one of the boldest constitutional experiments of antiquity, the Tetrarchy. There would not be one emperor carrying the impossible burden alone, but multiple emperors sharing command. Senior rulers, the Augusti, would oversee broad imperial zones. Junior rulers, the Caesars, would support them and, in theory, inherit in an orderly sequence. Responsibility would be divided. Frontiers would be managed more efficiently. Succession would be disciplined. Chaos would be replaced by design. It was a brilliant solution to the problem of pressure. But it was not a solution to the problem of ambition. The Tetrarchy could distribute authority, but it could not extinguish the oldest force in politics, the belief that one man, one family, one army, or one capital had a truer claim than the system itself. As long as Roman power remained bound to military prestige and personal aura, any constitutional arrangement would face the same final test. Could it survive when ambitious men declined to treat it as sacred? It could not. Abdications came. Deaths followed. Claims multiplied. The elegant geometry of Diocletian's order began to splinter under the familiar weight of succession politics. In this unraveling, Constantine emerged with a formidable advantage. He was the son of Constantius Chlorus, one of the Tetrarchic rulers, and bloodline still mattered deeply in Roman political imagination even when constitutional theory pretended otherwise. But lineage alone never decided an imperial contest. Constantine also had something more immediate and more dangerous, the loyalty of soldiers who had seen him near power and believed he belonged there. Opposite him stood Maxentius, whose claim rested on a different but equally potent source of legitimacy. Maxentius drew strength from Rome itself. He was tied to the old capital, to urban politics, to elite networks, to the resentments of those who believed that the imperial system had neglected or burdened the city that had once defined the empire. Taxation, exclusion, and political displacement had created a constituency for a ruler who could present himself as Rome's defender against distant administrative coldness. This is what gives the coming struggle its true depth. It was not Rome against barbarians. It was Rome against Rome. The empire was not defending civilization from an external enemy. It was fighting over the meaning of lawful authority within its own body. Who was the rightful emperor when institutions no longer commanded universal obedience? Was legitimacy constitutional, dynastic, military, urban, sacred, or simply victorious? In calmer ages, such questions can be managed by custom. In exhausted ages, they are answered by force. The religious landscape of AD 312 made the crisis still more profound. Public life in the Roman world remained dominated by the old gods, old cults, old civic rituals, and the inherited assumption that religion helped sustain the order of the state. Yet beneath that continuity, change was accelerating. Christianity was still a minority faith, but it was no longer politically negligible. Recent persecutions had failed to erase it. That failure mattered more than the persecutors understood. A state can suppress an institution. It can confiscate property. It can execute leaders. But when belief survives coercion, it reveals a dangerous truth to rulers: the state does not possess an absolute monopoly over the sacred. Rome's political order had long relied on the fusion of public power and religious legitimacy. Now, a growing faith existed that could not be fully managed by old categories. That did not yet mean Christian triumph. But it did mean that the empire was entering an age in which rulers would have to think differently about belief, authority, and allegiance. Therefore the stakes in AD 312 were immense. Control of Italy was at stake. Command of the Western Empire was at stake. Possession of Rome's symbolic capital was at stake. But beyond all that, something even larger hung in the balance, the chance to redefine what gave a ruler moral legitimacy in a tired civilization hungry for order yet suspicious of mere force. Constantine was especially suited to such a contest. He was not simply ambitious, though ambition coursed through every imperial contender of the age. He was a commander shaped by frontier realities, by movement, by hardness, by the strategic logic of acting before the enemy had arranged his full strength. Frontier war rewarded speed, disciplined violence, and the cultivation of confidence. Constantine learned to project all three. His career depended on appearing favored by fortune, trusted by soldiers, and capable of converting uncertainty into action. Such men are dangerous in civil war because they make initiative itself look like legitimacy. Every rapid success encourages neutrals to believe they are watching history choose its champion. Maxentius, by contrast, later suffered the misfortune of being described largely by the propaganda of his conqueror. Yet reduction is the enemy of understanding. Maxentius was not merely a cardboard tyrant waiting to be toppled by destiny. He was an able survivor in a lethal political environment. He had urban support in Rome. He undertook building projects. He understood the symbolic economy of the old capital. He knew how to turn resentment into rule. But he was also constrained by the very base that sustained him. A ruler tied closely to Rome possessed immense symbolic advantage, yet that advantage could become a trap. To defend the city was to appear legitimate. But to remain behind its defenses too long could also invite the accusation of timidity. A claimant who derived authority from Rome had to seem worthy of Rome's public gaze. Therefore Maxentius carried a burden beyond military calculation. He had to appear not merely secure, but sovereign. Constantine's Italian campaign in AD 312 exploited that burden with remarkable skill. It unfolded as a sequence of calibrated shocks rather than a blunt advance. Victories at Turin and Verona were not isolated tactical episodes. They formed a pattern. Each success compressed Maxentius's political room to maneuver. Each victory elevated Constantine's aura. Each defeated garrison or field force sent a message to elites, soldiers, and cities: this invader was not stumbling through Italy. He was imposing momentum upon it. In civil war, momentum is never merely military. It is psychological, administrative, and moral. Officials begin to calculate. Cities begin to hedge. Soldiers begin to compare the confidence of opposing commanders. A campaign can become self-accelerating when one side appears to be collecting the favor of fate. Constantine understood this dynamic. Therefore his aggression was not reckless. It was politically calibrated. The object was not just to beat Maxentius's forces. The object was to make continued resistance seem like defiance against a rising inevitability. Here lay the critical asymmetry. Constantine's force was comparatively smaller, but it possessed cohesion, initiative, and campaign confidence. Maxentius controlled fortified Rome and had larger resources at his disposal, but those advantages contained hidden poison. A fortress can preserve strength, but it can also preserve indecision. A larger resource base can sustain defense, but it can also deepen expectations that the ruler must act decisively. Every day that Maxentius remained cautious gave Constantine another day to appear bold. Every day spent behind walls risked looking less like prudence and more like fear. Civil wars are often won by the side better able to redefine caution as weakness. Then comes the most famous and most contested element in the story, the vision tradition. According to Lactantius, Constantine experienced a dream instructing him to mark his soldiers' shields with a heavenly sign. Eusebius, writing later and with greater theological grandeur, offered the celebrated account of a skyborne vision associated with the cross and divine promise. These accounts have fueled centuries of debate. Did Constantine experience a genuine religious event? Did memory transform a private conviction into a public miracle? Did later writers refine and magnify what had originally been more ambiguous? Historical honesty requires restraint. The sources do not permit tidy certainty. Memory, propaganda, faith, and political narrative are entangled here. But the deeper historical question is not solved by forcing a crude choice between miracle and invention. The vision mattered because it became a strategic fact either way. If Constantine sincerely believed himself chosen, then the event gave him existential confidence at the decisive moment. If the story was curated and amplified, then it supplied a revolutionary political language for authority. If both are true at once, then the episode reveals one of history's most enduring realities: power often advances through beliefs that are honestly felt and publicly weaponized. The modern mind often seeks clean separation between conviction and strategy. Human history rarely provides it. Especially at the summit of power, rulers do not always distinguish clearly between what they believe, what they need, and what the age is ready to hear. Constantine may have been moving through all three realms at once. Against this mounting pressure, Maxentius made the decision that still defines the campaign's strategic riddle: he left Rome and offered battle. From a purely defensive perspective, this seems deeply hazardous. Fortified Rome, supply depth, and attritional logic all suggested that patience was his ally. An invader with a smaller force could have been stretched, delayed, and politically blunted. But politics had begun to erode strategy. Omens may have played a role. Internal pressure surely did. Overconfidence cannot be dismissed. Nor can the need to interrupt Constantine's aura before it became irreversible. Therefore Maxentius abandoned his strongest shield because remaining behind it was becoming politically intolerable. This is one of the oldest tragedies in statecraft. Leaders often make the worst strategic choice because the better strategic choice appears humiliating. They fear the optics of weakness more than the consequences of error. Thus the logic of legitimacy can drag rulers away from sound military judgment and into the very confrontation they are least prepared to survive. On October 28 AD 312, at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, all these tensions converged. Campaign momentum, symbolic rivalry, religious meaning, and command judgment compressed into a crisis measured not in years, but in hours. This was the pivot. Not because every consequence was immediate, but because the battle fused military decision with civilizational narrative in a way few engagements ever do. Maxentius positioned himself with the Tiber at his back, relying in part on a temporary bridge arrangement near the permanent crossing. That choice was more than tactical. In civil war, retreat routes carry moral meaning. To prepare too openly for withdrawal is to confess uncertainty. To appear too rigidly committed is to risk catastrophe if fortune turns. Maxentius's deployment reflected a regime trapped between those imperatives. It needed to look resolute, but it also sought an escape valve. The problem was that an escape route becomes deadly when too many men need it at once. Constantine's method was brutally simple and strategically mature: pressure, then rupture. His army had learned through the campaign to expect success. Confidence in armies is not a decorative virtue. It changes tempo, cohesion, and the willingness to exploit an opening before the enemy recovers. Constantine's forces attacked with the assurance of men who had been advancing through Italy as victors, not petitioners. Once contact intensified and Maxentius's line began to bend, the battle ceased to be a contest of symmetrical wills. It became a struggle between an army trying to maintain order and an army sensing the moment to break it. Battles often appear decisive in retrospect because one side eventually collapses. But collapse itself is usually a chain reaction. Men see standards shifting. Units lose alignment. Command signals fail to restore coherence. The possibility of orderly retreat narrows by the minute. At Milvian Bridge, the central blunder was not simply losing ground. It was allowing the loss of ground to funnel into constrained terrain at the river crossing. An army can survive defeat. It often cannot survive panic inside a bottleneck. Once retreat compressed toward the bridge and the Tiber, military disorder became physical disaster. Too many men, too little space, too little command over movement. This is how a battlefield loss turns into dynastic annihilation. The river, the crossing, and the sudden collapse of organized withdrawal magnified defeat into catastrophe. Maxentius himself died in the Tiber. That fact transformed the political meaning of the battle instantly. Had he escaped, the war might have continued in another form, with another center of resistance, another attempt to contest the narrative. But his death closed that possibility with shocking finality. A dead rival cannot negotiate, regroup, or reinterpret events. Therefore Constantine's victory was not merely operational. It became theatrical, symbolic, almost judicial. He entered Rome not simply as the stronger claimant, but as the survivor of a trial that seemed to many contemporaries to reveal the verdict of history itself. That is why the propaganda triumph mattered so profoundly. Civil war always leaves a stain. It involves Romans killing Romans, institutions being bent against themselves, and power taking shape through blood that must later be morally explained. Victors in civil war do not merely suppress enemies. They launder necessity into legitimacy. Constantine did this with extraordinary effectiveness. The defeated ruler was presented as a tyrant. The victor was framed as a liberator. The battlefield was interpreted not as one contender's success, but as divine favor made visible. This was the genius of the post-war narrative. It did not deny violence. It redeemed it. It converted a brutal contest for supremacy into a moral drama in which rightful rule had overthrown oppression. That transformation of meaning was as important as the battle itself, because empires are not stabilized by force alone. They are stabilized when force is absorbed into a story that elites can repeat, cities can accept, and future generations can inherit. The consequences radiated quickly. In AD 313, the agreement commonly associated with Milan advanced toleration for Christianity. The empire did not instantly become Christian. Temples still stood. Traditional cults remained embedded in public life. The old religious world did not evaporate overnight because one emperor won one battle. But the direction of imperial favor had unmistakably shifted. That shift was historic because it altered incentives. Christianity was no longer merely a faith that could endure persecution. It was becoming a faith that could coexist with, and increasingly benefit from, imperial protection. In political terms, that changed everything. A religion once treated as suspect could now become useful. A bishop could become more than a local spiritual leader, he could become part of the empire's emerging moral architecture. Yet caution remains essential. Milvian Bridge was not the final triumph of Christianity, nor was it the end of Roman civil war. Constantine still faced rivals. Only after AD 324 would he stand as sole ruler of the empire. Therefore AD 312 should not be mythologized into a complete revolution accomplished in a single afternoon. History seldom works that neatly. But something fundamental did change in that year, the grammar of power. A Roman emperor could now present Christian association as an asset rather than a liability. That was a profound reconfiguration of legitimacy. For centuries, the Roman state had treated religion largely as a public technology of order, a means by which civic life, imperial authority, and sacred ritual reinforced one another. Constantine did not abandon that instinct. He redirected it. The strategic genius of his age was not the invention of religion in politics, that was ancient. The innovation was the fusion of imperial rule with a universalizing faith whose claims extended beyond city, ethnicity, or local cult. The consequences of that fusion would echo for centuries. Law would be reshaped by Christian moral discourse. Kingship would borrow sacral language with renewed force. Empire and church would become entangled in cooperation, rivalry, and mutual dependence. Europe's moral imagination would be altered not merely by doctrine, but by the precedent that universal truth and imperial power could recognize one another. This is why the question of Constantine's motives remains so compelling and so difficult. Was he a convert? Was he a strategist? Was he both? Reduction fails because human motives at great turning points are rarely pure enough for later categories. Conviction and advantage do not stand apart like neatly labeled archives. They mix, reinforce, and disguise one another. A ruler may believe sincerely in a sign that also serves his political purpose. He may embrace a faith while also understanding its utility in binding together a fractured world. Great historical transformations often emerge not from pure ideals or pure cynicism, but from motives mixed beyond recovery. That ambiguity is not a weakness in the story. It is the story. It reminds us that history is made by human beings whose inner worlds are inseparable from the structures they inhabit and the opportunities they seize. The philosophical lesson of Milvian Bridge is therefore larger than one emperor and one battle. Societies in crisis search for rulers who can unite force with meaning. Military power can seize a capital. But it cannot alone define why obedience should endure after the battle. Symbols, beliefs, and moral narratives perform that deeper work. Armies can win cities, stories can win centuries. Milvian Bridge matters because it reveals how legitimacy is not only established by battlefield success, but sanctified in the tale told afterward. The sword opens the gate. The story decides what the opened gate will mean. Here lies the modern mirror. Whenever power wraps itself in moral destiny, the stakes rise beyond ordinary policy. This pattern is not confined to religion. It appears in nations that claim historical missions, in revolutions that claim ethical inevitability, in states that cast opponents not merely as rivals but as enemies of civilization itself. Once power clothes itself in transcendent purpose, compromise becomes weakness, defeat becomes heresy, and politics begins to feel apocalyptic. That is the enduring warning carried by this bridge over the Tiber. The fusion of force and sacred meaning can produce order, resilience, and extraordinary civilizational energy. But it can also enlarge conflict until every contest appears final. The same mechanism that stabilizes a regime can radicalize its ambitions. The verdict is stark. Constantine's victory at the Milvian Bridge secured control of Rome and transformed the Western imperial balance. More than that, it accelerated one of the great political realignments in history, the passage of Christianity from persecuted minority to imperially favored force. The immediate cost was Roman blood in a Roman civil war. The deeper cost was the final demonstration that late imperial legitimacy would be decided not by institutions alone, but by the successful marriage of military triumph and moral narrative. The modern mirror is sharper still. Exhausted societies repeatedly seek leaders who promise not only order, but meaning. They do not merely ask who can rule. They ask who can justify rule in language large enough to calm fear, sanctify sacrifice, and organize loyalty. That hunger has never vanished. It has only changed vocabulary. And so the final question remains. When a civilization becomes uncertain of what grants authority its right to command, does it choose the ruler who best protects its institutions, or the ruler who can make power feel like destiny?